Countdown is down to 2 for Big Ten and Ohio State football fans. The season is finally almost here. Fingers still have to be crossed. Nebraska's in town on Saturday at the Shoe. Buckeyes and the Huskers. We got Pat Murphy on the line for Bucknuts to break down the matchup. Pat, how you doing today?
I'm good. Excited that we actually have a football game, in 2 days here to talk about. So last few times we've talked, it's either been speculation or coming down the line, and now we're almost there.
People ramped up about watching this Ohio State football team, not just in the Buckeye State, but I think across the nation in regards to what we've seen out of Alabama and Clemson, to see whether that third member of the elite status is all that we think that they probably are. I know that Ryan Day was pushed for an answer or two during the media call the other day, but didn't necessarily go in that direction. And most great football coaches don't, because the mission is Nebraska, the next play, the next drive, the next series.
If there's a coach that I'm starting to compare Ryan Day to in terms of questions like big picture things, and even some of the smaller picture things, is Jim Tressel. He reminds me a lot of Tressel when you didn't get the answer you wanted, you got the answer that Tressel wanted out of things. And Ryan Day was asked about kind of that. What do they have to do to fit into that Clemson, Alabama picture that everyone has kind of painted so far as the top two teams in the country and the two teams that look the most likely to be there at the end? And he didn't want to talk about that. As you said, it was all about Nebraska. It was that his team can't think that far ahead because, any little slip up, and not only on the field, but off the field with how seriously they're taking the COVID protocols, could cost them a season. So, you only have 8 games. You have, 9, including a Big Ten championship game theoretically. And, you can't mess that up any sort of way if you want to be in the college football playoff. You don't want to give the playoff committee the chance to have any questions about you. So it's about going out and executing this weekend, and then they'll focus on next weekend when that comes, and, so on and so forth. And I don't think Ryan Day will want to talk college football playoff or Big Ten championship or any of those things until we get to that point. Now, you and I can talk about it, and I think that it's a very fair conversation to have about Ohio State. I've watched Alabama. I've watched Clemson. Both have looked very good. It's tough to judge, really, these teams because they're only playing conference opponents. We don't have any sort of, non-conference, well, this team played this team, and so we have a sense of how good they are outside of the conference. But I do think it is clear, Clemson with the way that they've beat teams so far this year, Alabama, the offense that they have, we'll see as they go down. Both teams, they'll have stiffer tests, but they look the part so far, and that's all you can ask on the schedule.
And certainly appears, Pat, as though the betting public sides on the side of Ohio State being that juggernaut that we anticipated. 21-point favorite to open. It's ballooned to 26. Let's talk a little Nebraska football, then we'll dive into Ohio State personnel for this one. Scott Frost signed through 2026, off to a rough start. We saw the big improvement over the final 6 games of 2018, which included a 5-point loss at Ohio Stadium against the team that would eventually finish in the top 3 with a Rose Bowl win. But then so many expectations going into last season. They didn't meet those. Adrian Martinez, 10 touchdowns, 9 picks. But still, it was a pretty, at least statistically, a pretty strong offense last year. 5th in the Big Ten in scoring, 7th in total yardage. Luke McCaffrey gave Martinez a battle for the starting job, but Adrian Martinez ready to go and suit up for the Buckeyes. Your thoughts about Nebraska offensively and overall?
I'm very interested to see Ohio State tested to at least to some degree by this Nebraska team. You mentioned Adrian Martinez. Obviously, he's the big name quarterback in the start of the last 2 years. Familiar with coming into Ohio State and playing well. You brought up that game a couple of years ago where Nebraska really hung with Ohio State, and on the road, Scott Frost's first year. That was when I thought, okay, Nebraska's moving in the right direction. Obviously, it hasn't gone the way that Husker fans hoped. The prime example being the game in Lincoln against Ohio State last year. But I think Adrian Martinez is a quarterback that gives you a lot to think about. Similar to Justin Fields, maybe not quite as skilled, but he can beat you with his arm. He can beat you with his legs. They've got a running back in Dedrick Mills, who's very talented. Wan'Dale Robinson, who's now primarily a wide receiver, used to move around a lot. It looks like he'll be more on the outside playing strictly wide receiver this year, but I'm assuming they'll use him in different ways. But the one thing I don't think is getting talked about enough is Nebraska's bringing back all 5 starting offensive linemen. And that doesn't happen very often. I think it's the first time in Nebraska since like 1969 or something like that. So to have that cohesive unit, especially given the offseason that we've had where you don't have a lot of time and they haven't had a lot of time in pads to hit each other and things like that. You've got an offensive line that already knows what they're doing with the guy next to them. That's an advantage. And an advantage over Ohio State, who's replacing 2 starters on the offensive line. The front 7 for Nebraska is very strong. They're going to test this Ohio State offensive line, I think, early and often. I think they're going to try and throw some unique things. This is a defense that plays a 3-4 primarily, but is not afraid to switch to a 4-3. So they're going to give Ohio State different looks, test some of the young, inexperienced offensive linemen, and see what they can get out of it. On paper, Ohio State's definitely the more talented team, but you never know in these games when you start the season without a lot of game film, without a ton of practice time against an opponent like Nebraska. And I imagine Scott Frost will have, as Ryan Day will, a few tricks up their sleeve that they've thought of given all this extra time to plan for the season.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, breaking down the Buckeyes with Pat Murphy from Bucknuts. Please check out his work and the rest of the crew there at 247 Sports. Again, bucknuts.com. Ohio State hosting Nebraska. Buckeyes had their way 38-0 at half. Final score 48-7 in Lincoln last year. But as we mentioned, a 36-31 final 2 years ago in Columbus when the Buckeyes were struggling on defense. Brendan James would be the top offensive lineman back for the Huskers out of the 5 you mentioned. What's going to be interesting is Scott Frost, accomplished as an offensive coordinator at Oregon, goes to UCF, turns that program around primarily based on a spread offense and getting the ball to the playmakers and doing all those things that we have grown accustomed to high-powered offense in 2020s football. And then he comes to Nebraska, and we're expecting the same here. Wan'Dale Robinson, a guy that's counted upon, as you just mentioned, and they really used him in the running game, but they want to focus him at wide receiver. They've got a lot of other guys coming into the fold. We'll see how those guys are used. They signed the number 1 JUCO wide receiver, Omar Manning, Xavier Betts, another player coming out of high school, and Marcus Fleming, Alante Brown, that gained a lot of pub as some of their higher signees from this past draft class. And you also mentioned Dedrick Mills, who had a big career at Georgia Tech, goes to Nebraska, scores 10 touchdowns last year, but they're really thin behind him. Ramir Johnson's probably the number 2 guy. It's a defense that ranked 10th in the Big Ten in scoring, 11th in total defense, and they lose a lot along that defensive front. And their top tackler, Mohamed Berry, Will Honus, 72 tackles, Ben Still, 65, would be 2 of their top tacklers that are back. All right, so we'll see what the Huskers have. Of course, they've probably drawn, I don't think there's any question, they've drawn the toughest schedule in the Big Ten, at least on their side, in addition to their division opponents, Ohio State, Penn State. So they did not get the fortunate draw there and trying to make it to a bowl game, although based on what we are hearing in recent weeks, the bowl selection process is pretty much just up to whoever wants to go play in a bowl game can this year. All right, Pat, we'll focus on the Buckeyes here. Like I told you before we started to record, I'm going to be intrigued to see how the running backs are used in the distribution of carries. What are your thoughts about that?
That is going to be interesting for sure, because you saw last year J.K. Dobbins was the guy. And Master T got some work, especially once he started to establish himself as a backup that could handle carries in the Big Ten. But when push came to shove in some of the bigger games, Penn State, Michigan, Clemson in the Fiesta Bowl, when J.K. Dobbins got hurt, Master Teague was not at his best and didn't even play in the Big Ten championship game against Wisconsin. So Master Teague had some improving to do this offseason. Then he hurts his Achilles, is back and claims to be 100%. So we'll see how that works. But Ohio State went out and got graduate transfer Trey Sermon from Oklahoma, who was a productive but not a star for the Sooners. Ohio State recruited him out of high school, saw him as a true freshman actually in Ohio Stadium when Oklahoma came in here and won. And Trey Sermon actually scored a receiving touchdown in that game. So they like the idea of having these two running backs. I am also interested to see how the breakdown goes in terms of carries. The last time we saw Ohio State have a two-headed monster at running back was a couple of years ago, J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber. And I think Buckeye fans were pretty frustrated because it was clear to most that J.K. Dobbins was the more talented of the two. Mike Weber, for all his recruiting accolades and whatnot, just never seemed to get it really going at Ohio State after getting hurt as a true freshman. So, you hope that is handled better, that the carries are either split down the middle in terms of you take one drive, you take the next drive, or that they are used in situational circumstances. You want as a running back to kind of get into a rhythm. So I'm more in favor of, hey, if one guy gets going, you let him run it for a while. But I understand that these are two talented guys. Ryan Day said today that they have a lot of similarities, so it's not like one guy is significantly better than the other at one skill. I do think Trey Sermon is better as the receiving back out of the backfield, but I also know that's something Master Teague has worked on. So to me, that will certainly be interesting. I imagine in this game you see a pretty even split between the two as they try and figure out what the best way to use these guys are. But I do believe that they have two very talented backs, and even behind them, Marcus Crowley's still coming back from an ACL injury from last November, but they really like what they got out of Steel Chambers this offseason. He's a redshirt freshman who played a little bit last year, and the true freshman Mayan Williams has done well. So you could see a number of guys get carries, but certainly the top two and the guys that I think at the end of the year will be at the top of the statistical charts are Trey Sermon and Master Teague.
We talk Buckeyes, we talk the Big Ten and the nation here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football each and every day. We've got Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts. So we would ask everyone to like the video, share the videos out on social media, and of course, subscribe. That way, when we're going live if you hit that bell for the notifications. Backup quarterback. Once the first play hits the field, obviously Justin Fields is out there, but we don't know who that number 2 guy is because Ryan Day was non-committal on that. So, Pat, what are your thoughts about the estimation that you have of what the depth chart should be?
What it should be, I believe, is one of the two talented true freshmen that Ohio State recruited. Jack Miller, CJ Stroud, both 4-star guys. Jack Miller's a guy who was committed for quite a while, came on suffered injuries, and kind of dropped in the rankings. CJ Stroud, the opposite, really came on late in the recruiting process. Guys that can do a little bit of everything. I think they're very excited about both of them. The question is, where do they stand in the pecking order? Also, Ohio State has Gunnar Hoke, who transferred from Kentucky last year, kind of as a depth player, but has established himself as a solid player for Ohio State. If I had to guess, and as you said, Ryan Day wasn't going to go into it. He said the backup quarterback competition would probably continue into the season just because there wasn't spring practice to get the young guys a lot of reps. If I had to guess, I would say that if Justin Fields, knock on wood, gets hurt against Nebraska on Saturday, Gunnar Hoke comes into the game. If that injury is a longer-term injury, I could see them eventually going to one of the freshmen, as I think they're probably more talented, less experienced. Now, if in the situation where Ohio State's up big, I could see one of the freshmen coming into the game to spell Justin Fields, just to get that guy experience in a real game setting, and maybe both of the guys in games down the line when they are big blowouts, get reps. So I honestly think Ryan Day doesn't have a set plan for it. I think there's plans for different situations. But I do think if the unfortunate situation happens and Justin Fields gets hurt, they need to, have a quarterback long-term. I do think you probably turn it over to one of the freshmen and kind of live with whatever happens there, because that's your future is either CJ Stroud or Jack Miller.
Well, it's an interesting take, and it makes a whole lot of sense what you just laid out there. Again, knock on wood, Justin Fields goes down. Buckeyes up 35-0. Well, nobody's going to blow the game. But if it's a 2-score game and they've got the lead, well, let's protect it. Let's go with the guy that we believe is less likely to make any mistakes. let's nurse home the 2-score win. And then, but looking down the road in terms of us still trying to salvage something big for this season, well, we got 2 high ceiling guys and we got a lot of practice that we can get them ready. And let's face it, unless somebody just completely blows up out there in regards to just throwing 5 picks a game, this team could possibly win a Big Ten championship. I would still bet on them winning a Big Ten championship with a backup quarterback in against the field in the Big Ten. Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts talking Ohio State with Nebraska in town. It's a noon kickoff at the Shoe. So those were my big questions just in regards to backup quarterback and running back. Is there anything that's you're going to gravitate to maybe a little bit more than anything else coming up Saturday?
The secondary is a question for me, and not necessarily in a I don't believe in that this secondary will be good. It's just you lose 3 NFL draft picks, 2 in the first round. All 3 guys are now starting in the NFL. You've got to replace those guys. Shaun Wade is back. He will be the primary cornerback, but beyond him, it's a lot of inexperience. So which guys, Sevyn Banks, Cameron Brown, Tyreek Johnson, who steps in there? Marcus Williamson, a senior, is expected to take the slot cornerback role. How does he perform? And then at safety, you lost Jordan Fuller, a starter for the Rams right now. Who is the guy there? They've talked about Josh Proctor. They've talked about Marcus Hooker. Marcus Hooker, obviously the younger brother of Malik Hooker. Both those guys bring unique skill sets to the table. So it's about finding the right group to play in that back end. You also have a new guy coaching that position in Carrie Combs, who is familiar to Ohio State fans because he was the cornerbacks coach previously under Urban Meyer, but he comes back to Ohio State from the Tennessee Titans. So, just a lot of newness in the secondary there that you'll have to get sorted out. I believe Ohio State will. I think all those guys are talented, and Carrie Combs obviously knows what he's doing. It's just a matter of getting it all sorted out again without having the normal preseason, without having those, I don't want to say cupcake non-conference games to kind of roll into things. You're facing a Big Ten team, needs a win week 1.
Pat, we led off with the Clemson-Alabama question, and as you stated, Ryan Day is not going to address it. I don't believe that he actually should, because, that's when you get in trouble, is talking about the national scene and not focusing on a difficult Big Ten schedule. But at the same time, we can talk about it, as you mentioned, in talking to the players, whether that was some of the conversations you've had directly with during the players and the player interviews, or just anything that you've heard, read since the season's been announced and players going back to practice and all of this. I'm sure they're towing the line 90% of the time, but has anybody let out any type of comment, phrasing, just about kind of matching up against the upper crust in college football and that type of talk?
Not necessarily matching up with, but I think these players have not kept it a secret that they believe this team's good enough to win a national championship. They thought they were good enough last year, came up a little short, obviously, and we've covered what happened in that game. But, part of the reason that they wanted to play so badly is because they think there's a chance to win a national championship here this season. If you wait till a spring and everyone else plays in the fall, you don't get that opportunity. Who knows what next year looks like. So this team believes it's talented enough to be there in the end. And, they're not shying away from those expectations. Ryan Day just wants them to take it one day at a time, which I think is the right approach. So yes, they've discussed the fact that they believe that they should be in that conversation. But as of right now, it's not talking about matching up with Alabama or Clemson or anything like that. It's just, we believe we're one of the best teams in the country, and they certainly are motivated and want to go out and show it after watching everyone else play the last several weeks.
All right. Once again, it's Pat Murphy joins us on a regular basis to talk Ohio State football, the Buckeyes and the Huskers at noon Eastern time at the Shoe on Saturday. Pat, we appreciate you stopping by as always. Finally get to talk, actually, if we can get you back next week, an actual game that we actually watched and were able to review.
For sure.